Mark, why don't you tell us about the Gates Foundation's role here? It is broad. You are involved in a lot of these different programs, but of course you're also studying the sort of health effects beyond COVID around the globe.
Yes, well, we work both what we call upstream with the R&D that you just heard about, and also downstream. How do you make sure that those products actually get to those who need them, and particularly those in low and middle income countries, basically poorer countries that have much tougher ability to distribute and get access. And so we've made direct investments both as the Gates Foundation and through a group called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, in a number of those vaccine and other treatment products that you just heard about. And then we also have been supporting an effort called the Therapeutics Accelerator, which has been looking for ways to get therapeutics, basically treatments, more speedily available, and have worked in some of the trials and tests, for example, that came out and showed the utility of dexamethasone as a potential treatment. And then we've also been working directly with a number of developing countries and partners and regulators, such as, say, the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, about how you help countries actually get ready at a regulatory basis in terms of distribution for what we hope will be a wave of interventions coming through in the new year.
We do hope so. Janet, maybe update us if you can on where we stand along those lines. You have the FDA perspective, obviously having been there since 1986, but you've also crossed over to oversee therapeutics at Operation Warp Speed. Help us sort of understand the progress that's been made. Okay, I'm not sure if we have Dr. Woodcock's feed just now. So until I'm told that she is back with us, let's talk with Michelle and Mark. I'd like to ask your guys' thoughts, kind of starting at the end, if we can, the question of how do we get out of this? What does the path to that look like? Mark, I wonder if you could sort of set the stage for where do you see us sort of getting beyond the pandemic? How do we get there? What does that timing look like to you?
Yeah, well, first we have to just focus on what we can do right now with the tools at hand. And that is where testing, the social distancing, the use of masks, all those things that we've heard about remain essential. Countries and communities need to adhere to those because that's the best way to prevent transmission. Then within that, we're already seeing steps, improvements in basic ways in which we do treat cases. We have some of the newer treatments that we've talked about, like the dexamethasone or remdesivir, which is the Gilead product. We've now got some of the monoclonal antibodies coming up for potential regulatory approval. And those are important steps until we get the vaccine. But the vaccine is going to be the critical game changer. And we do have multiple products. And so far, the news is pretty good in terms of the trials. Most of the vaccine products are performing pretty well. But, these things often fail at the last hurdle. That's why it's so important that you do rigorous testing, that we do try and get multiple products. And for our purposes, meaning at the Gates Foundation, when we're thinking about how you get that distribution down into literally billions of people in poor countries, you've also got to think about the affordability of manufacture and distribution. Some of the products that are being looked at and are close to development will be very expensive to produce, very difficult to transport. Some of them need ultra cool cold chains, ultra low temperature cold chains. And so we're working and obviously hoping that some of the more successful we can do more easily and distribute and manufacture more easily.
Absolutely. I mean, Michelle, along those lines, thinking about the efforts we've seen from the industry here, obviously companies have had to turn their focus to this immediate and giant threat. Help us understand how your industry thinks about those calculations, making these affordable, putting the work into manufacturing them all at risk. How does this work for for-profit companies?
Well, I think it involves a huge leap of faith, and that is really the good news behind the industry. The industry has not stopped to ask, Will all of these costs be recouped? Will this be something that works out in the end? We are an industry that's used to taking large chances in the name of trying to improve human health. And that's what you're seeing in action today. I mean, it's wonderful that we have over 180 vaccine candidates, because that gives us a tremendous number of shots on goal. Because as Mark rightly points out, many fail. And so we want to have all of those options and all of those attempts. And then even after we get to the successful stage, we're likely to have more than a few that are successful. And this is exactly what we need. We need a variety in terms of routes of administration, whether you need one dose or two, the ability to be transported without cold chains. All of these levers are really, really important to have a variety in our arsenal so that we can really reach the entire globe. And our industry is not just committed to producing the solutions, but also making sure that we are out there working to make sure there's access to the solutions at the end of the day, not just to vaccines, where we've been very active both domestically and globally around trying to make sure that there's affordable access to the vaccine and that there's compensation for any unforeseen injury or complication, but also in terms of therapeutics. Just in September, we hosted our first COVID therapeutic access summit, where we brought together stakeholders from a variety of points of view to say, what are some of the new solutions we can get to make sure everyone has affordable access to the therapeutics once they come online, because we need to.
Absolutely. Well, I just got a notification. We have Janet. I hope that's true. Dr. Woodcock, are you with us? And tell us about the work that you're seeing happen along these lines.
Which is trying to probably know whether or not they're actually working.
Dr. Woodcock, I'm afraid that your feed is just a little bit spotty. Yeah, I think they'll keep working on making sure that your feed is strong, and we'll have you come back and join us once they've let me know that has happened. In the meantime, Mark, I'm going to come back to you. Thinking about needing to make sure that people actually get access to these therapies and vaccines, what lessons can be learned from previous pandemics, epidemics, where things maybe haven't gone right, or things have really gone right? I mean, what can we take away from 2009 with H1N1? What can we take away from the Ebola epidemic in West Africa?
Yeah, so look at it in two ways. One, outside of pandemics, or looking at some of the bigger ongoing pandemics like the HIV/AIDS pandemic, what the world did learn to do was the importance of coming together through multilateral frameworks where you pooled governmental expertise, private sector expertise, philanthropic resources, and in that case created the Global Fund to fight HIV, TB, and malaria. And that has been a dramatic game changer, saving literally tens of millions of lives, providing cheaper antiretrovirals and other treatments. And so we see the world has muscle and has experience in developing these kind of institutions, and they're done with the support and direct participation of the developing countries who are facing the greatest burden. So that's one model. The second is, coming from the Ebola experience, one thing we learned from Ebola in West Africa, the three countries that were most affected, was that actually the ancillary effects of the epidemic can be worse than the actual direct effects. We actually had more women dying of preventable deaths in childbirth, maternal mortality, and child mortality as a result of that outbreak because of the knock-on effect on primary healthcare clinics and other treatments. And so we're desperately trying to make sure the same doesn't happen with COVID. And so you need to keep a strong focus on ordinary primary healthcare support and needs for whether it's malaria, whether it's basic childhood vaccinations. But then what you can also do is put in place infrastructures which are better at testing, tracing, treatment. Those countries are low resource countries, but they learned the hard way how important it is to be able to monitor and track. And in fact, have been performing relatively well as a result in the COVID crisis. And so they've built muscle from that experience, even without the kind of resources that richer countries can bring to bear. So, there are some encouraging sort of examples and models for what the world can do, based on the past and what I hope we will be doing as these COVID treatments come online and we start getting them to those who need them.
That's
can
fascinating.
I just add to that?
Mhm.
Can I just add to that? It's so important, as Mark is pointing out, that we marry our high cutting edge biotechnology with basic public health. We cannot forget our public health techniques. I'm a daughter of a public health nurse, and I would be remiss if I did not underscore how important those public health approaches are, because if we're going to get to the end stage of this illness, which you talked about at the beginning, Meg, it's really important that we're able to get the vaccine out there, that we have confidence in the vaccine, that we're able to reach populations that are not so easy to get to from our vantage point today, and that we remember our public health principles.
Well, along those lines, if and when a vaccine becomes available, the trust in a vaccine. Michelle, maybe you can talk about the fact that the industry felt like it needed to come out with a pledge to put safety first. One perspective on that might be, well, we'd hope you always do that. Why did you feel you needed to make a pledge on this now?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because one of the things we started to see over the course of the summer was an erosion of public trust in the vaccine. Yes, we're seeing unprecedented speed, and that is in part because everyone's collaborating in a way that we've never seen before. And we've made progress, scientific progress, in the last few decades that has allowed us to go faster. But it's also because everyone is trying to get to this very, very important goal. So in doing so, in having that speed, we have to make sure that the public is coming along with us, that they understand that this is not at the expense of safety and it's not at the expense of human life. It's really about trying to do everything we can to save as many lives as possible. And part of that confidence comes from our regulators. I'm a former FDA official, one who really respects Janet's work. She's been such a leader in this space, and we're so glad to have her involved in Operation Warp Speed. But it's because our regulators have been so trusted through the years that people have confidence in the medicines that are on their shelves today. And so we can't do anything to politicize that process, to undermine or erode that trust. We have to make sure that trust continues and is protected. So to that extent, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization sent a letter signed by our 5 former board chairs and myself, really calling upon regulators to uphold their high standards and the scientists involved to do everything they can to show transparency in that science. And then we were so joyed to see our 9 leading vaccine manufacturers pledging to do just that. But it's important that we not let down our guard. Just about a week and a half ago, we sent a letter to Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, just calling on him to release guidance about what the parameters would be for any emergency use authorization of a COVID vaccine. And it was so wonderful to see a short few days later, the agency release that guidance, because it's not enough to convey to the individual manufacturers what's needed. The public needs clear line of sight as to what these requirements are, and scientists around the world need to pressure test them and show that they have confidence in the system as well.
Yeah, I mean, we did get to see those vaccine guidelines come out, but of course it was after a back and forth where they appeared to be blocked from the White House. The FDA actually seemed to be asserting itself by sort of releasing the guidelines through briefing documents that came out ahead of the Vaccine Advisory Committee meeting at the end of this month. Mark, I wonder, can you share your perspective on what you're observing here in the United States? I think it's an objective statement to say vaccines have been politicized. The president keeps tying this to the availability of a vaccine to Election Day. We heard about it in the vice presidential debate where Kamala Harris said she wouldn't take a vaccine if only President Trump recommended it. She'd wait for doctors like Dr. Fauci. So Mark, what are you seeing sort of in the US and around the world in terms of trust in a vaccine?
Yeah, so taking a step back again, one of the key things that we find, and we work extensively on vaccine distribution across the world, especially with our partner Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, is that in many developing countries where the kind of diseases that we no longer think about in the US or in Europe, like polio or tuberculosis or other related activities or challenges, there is much wider acceptance of vaccines. people see the utility of it. They understand the importance. Mothers will trek miles in order to bring their children in to get vaccinated. And I think one of the challenges in the West is that, vaccines have been so effective that for a lot of diseases like measles and related ones, people have forgotten just how serious they are. And that's why it is so critically important that institutions like the FDA are given the space and freedom to exercise their core responsibilities as regulators to ensure the safety and efficacy of all new products that come through, because that is essential to developing and retaining public trust. So we are hugely supportive of both the release of all those wider guidelines, that we do take all the necessary steps for safety. We go through all the proper trials that we can very carefully consider before there are emergency regulatory steps. But science needs to be the driver of those decisions, and independent regulators need to oversee that. And in the end, it's the work of those regulators that also informs the WHO, the World Health Organization, who then come up with global guidelines that the rest of the world can use. So in that context, we can't overemphasize how critically important it is that these regulators are allowed to do their jobs effectively, because that is going to be the key to long-term public acceptance.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm told we have Dr. Woodcock. There you are. This is brilliant. I'm so happy to see you. All right, let's start with what you were telling us before about the progress that we're making.
Certainly. Well, Operation Warp Speed is an effort by the U.S. government between the Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Defense. And main goal is to move along the development of vaccines, therapeutics, and even diagnostics as rapidly as possible. And to that end, providing assistance, logistical, financial, regulatory, you name it, kind of assistance to manufacturers, including, paying for scale up before we know whether or not products are effective. This decreases the risk for manufacturers and is different than traditional drug development, where you would wait to know before you made large quantities of a product whether or not it was going to pass the tests. So that's what we have been focusing on. We are not we do not interfere with the regulators in any way. That's a separate scientific decision. Once those trials are done, once that manufacturing is put into place, they get to decide upon whether it meets the standards. So we are supporting multiple vaccine development programs, as well as a number of therapeutic development programs, particularly monoclonal antibodies. And we are supporting large trials through the NIH and active on both monoclonal antibodies, anticoagulants, and immunomodulators.
Well, I wonder if you could help us in particular understand monoclonal antibodies. They've obviously been in the news. The Regeneron combination was one of the drugs given to President Trump. We've learned now AstraZeneca has just struck a supply and manufacturing deal with the U.S. government for about $500 million for 100,000 doses. Tell us about how these could work, and do they look promising?
Yes, well, the monoclonal antibodies are one of the few drugs that could be developed in this time frame specifically against the virus. A small molecule antiviral, for example, or immunomodulator in a short time frame of a year would have to be a repurposed drug. In other words, it would have to have been developed for something else and moved over and used here. And that's what we're seeing with dexamethasone or with remdesivir, for example. But the monoclonal antibodies, due to the platform technologies we have today, could be developed specifically to neutralize this virus, right? And there are many of them. There are 20 or more programs going on. And they could be used theoretically all the way from prevention, for example, prophylaxis of people, giving them antibodies if they don't have their own that would prevent them from acquiring the virus, to early treatment of outpatients, all the way through to potentially treatment in patients. And The early data we have seen, which has come from Lilly and Regeneron, which is public, show that the vast majority of people sort of clear the virus on their own and get better. And that's why they get better. Their immune system fights off the virus. But it looks like some people either have a delayed immune response or an ineffective one. And in those patients, giving them the antiviral antibody clears the virus more rapidly than if they didn't get the antibody. And also, it appears in the whole group, there's shortened symptoms of the disease. And Lilly had a number of people who were hospitalized in their trial. This wasn't the primary endpoint, it was a trial of virology. But they had a number of people hospitalized, and they had many fewer people hospitalized in the in the treatment group than in the placebo group. So there's hope that this shortening of symptoms could actually translate into a clinical benefit in decreasing the number of people who are headed to the hospital.
Absolutely. I wonder if you could also just help us, Dr. Woodcock, with the process. I know you're not involved in actually making the FDA decision about these drugs, but how does the EUA evaluation, the emergency use authorization evaluation process go with the FDA? And considering that the data that have been available so far are in a specific indication, essentially the situation where President Trump was, where you're recently diagnosed with the disease, would we expect that the emergency use authorization would be very specific to the results we've seen so far?
Well, it would be really unlikely the FDA would extrapolate for a new molecular entity, which is, an unknown drug, so to speak, beyond what population the drug was tested in. People need to realize, of course, though, that the emergency use authorization situation is different than a drug approval. And it actually, and this has caused, I think, a lot of confusion out there, but an emergency use authorization for a vaccine that would be used to inoculate healthy people is quite different in its standards from emergency use of a therapeutic. And an outpatient therapeutic would have higher requirements than for the very sickest people. So people were, concerned about hydroxychloroquine and the authorization for that, but that was for very sick inpatients when nothing else was available. We're in quite a different situation now where we have several effective drugs available for inpatients. And so, that changes the benefit risk assessment. So I think for the monoclonals, the data that have been publicly released do show some virologic benefit, and the FDA is going to have to decide if the actual clinical benefit warrants an EUA.
And how fast can the FDA really act in these situations?
Well, it depends on how fast the sponsor coughs up the clinical data, right? Because these are coming out of clinical trials, and they have to pull the data together and make it available to the agency. And the agency doesn't look at just summary tables. They're going to look at the actual patient data and decide, were the reports valid? Did we find other problems? Are there safety issues? And so forth. So it depends on, again, the setting. For example, for remdesivir, it was rather speedy. That was a industry-sponsored trial, and so they had the data available and were able to get some of that top-line data at least out and give it to the agency. And at the time, there were no other treatments available, really, that had been demonstrated to be effective.
Well, Michelle, Dr. McMurry-Heath, I wonder if you could kind of walk us through how the industry will be involved here as we think about getting these monoclonal antibodies, if they are authorized, out to be used. There will obviously be limited supply of them, but drug makers are working together to manufacture things in ways we've almost never seen before. But also there will be questions about, trying to figure out for whom these therapies will work best. Do you need to test people to see if they have an immune response before deciding whether to give them the drug? And then these are infused, so making sure the patients can get where they need to go for treatment. I mean, how are your member companies sort of thinking through all of these complications?
Well, there's a lot packed in there. One of the really key issues you touched upon is being able to manufacture at scale, making sure we have the capacity to produce these, and particularly manufacturing biologics like vaccines, like antibodies is very, very challenging, and we usually have limited manufacturing capacity. In March, we actually had a manufacturing summit to try to figure out who has what manufacturing capacity that they could lend or borrow or collaborate to give, so that once we have successful candidates, we can make them at scale. We've been continuing that work globally, trying to link different manufacturing capacity up to different promising candidates so that we are able to manufacture what we need when we need it. And Janet hit upon something very important, which is unlike the normal mode of operating, we're starting to manufacture at scale before we even have that final proof that the candidate is successful, so that we will have enough to hopefully meet the demand as these therapies come on board. Now, when you talk about who is eligible for which treatment, a lot of that is going to depend, as Janet mentioned, in conversation with the regulator. So they'll have specific data on specific types of patients at a specific stage of the illness, and that will be the indication. And so our companies will be providing their drugs and therapies for those indications only. We're also looking at guidance coming out of the CDC. The CDC has a national vaccine strategy group that is specifically involved in looking at who should get the vaccine when, and weighing those benefit risk calculations so that the sickest or most vulnerable are able to access a vaccine as soon as it comes online, as opposed to those of us who perhaps have fewer risk factors or have less exposure who could wait a little bit later in the process. So there's balancing that benefit risk, balancing that need, that clinical need that will be involved in the process as well. And then finally, there's the question of access and making sure that no patient has to pay, as we would say, out of pocket for COVID therapeutics. It should be covered. We've already successfully fought for Medicare to have zero copay for COVID therapeutics. We are working to see if there's ways to expand Medicaid in the states so that those who are recently unemployed could have access to Medicaid and therefore COVID therapeutics if they were to become ill. And then we're partnering with our global partners, particularly partners like the Gates Foundation and others, to try to see what we can do at the global level to try to assure access to therapeutics, because we have to stop this pandemic. It is putting all of us at risk. It is so important for us to marshal all of our resources to try to find an end to this.
Well, you mentioned Mark. So Mark, I'm going to bring you in, but right before I do, I want to tell everybody our polling is up, and I want to ask the first polling question. It's actually polling question number 4 that I will bring up first. If everybody could respond while we talk with Mark. The question is, how concerned are you about a renewed wave of COVID-19 infections? If folks in the audience could vote on that, I'm going to turn the question to Mark here. About access to these antibody therapies and what Michelle was just telling us about working together to try to ensure access to them around the globe. What can you tell us about that? And particularly given they're very expensive, they're very complicated therapies. What are the challenges here? And will we realistically see access to them around the world?
Yes, so first, one of the great things that has been done, and Dana talked about Operation Warp Speed and others, has been the upstream funding by wealthy countries, particularly the United States, that's helping underwrite the development and some of the early manufacturing of key vaccines and therapeutics. And that is critical. But unfortunately, that is not helping ensure that there's going to be equitable distribution. At the Gates Foundation, we have an annual report called the Goalkeepers Report, which looks at the effect and normally the progress that's being made in development. And we had some modeling done by Northeastern University, which showed that if you had the first 2 billion doses of any vaccine distributed exclusively to rich countries, which on current trends would be the likely outcome because of all the bilateral deals they have, or if you had it distributed equitably across all countries, you would save twice as many lives by doing it equitably. And so we think it's really important that you think about that wider access. And so as the Gates Foundation, we've been trying to do it in a couple of ways. We've worked with a number of industry partners and came out with a joint communique with 16 major life sciences companies about a week ago, which made a joint commitment towards equitable access and manufacturing and regulatory treatment, which is a critical milestone and is pretty unprecedented in the industry. Second, there's a global effort called the ACT-A Accelerator, which a number of countries, in fact, most countries in the world, over 150, have joined in, which is trying to pool resources to have access to vaccines and ensure that then there's equitable distribution across all participating countries with effectively subsidies for the poorer countries. Unfortunately, the United States is one of the very few countries that has chosen not to participate in that to date, but it's a very encouraging step and is raising critical resources. And then last but not least, as the Gates Foundation, we've been trying to model that with some early deals. So for example, just last week, we announced a deal with Eli Lilly about their monoclonal antibody, where pending regulatory approval, we had already reserved some of that scarce manufacturing capacity because we knew there would be a rush for it, mostly for rich countries, and we reserved it specifically for use in developing countries. And now we've reached a deal with Eli Lilly where they will be providing their monoclonal antibody, again, pending regulatory approval, and we will make sure those doses do get to developing countries. But we also have to think about all those clinical steps. I say that's an expensive treatment. It requires a hospital setting to provide at the moment. So, there are other additional challenges, but providing the resources to allow for that manufacturing scale and ensuring equitable access at the front end are two of the key steps.
Absolutely. And Mark, just a follow-up question from you that came in from the audience. It's about that, the complicated nature of delivering these antibodies, given that they are infusions. One of our audience members asks, will monoclonal antibodies even be an option for the developing world as they require infusions, which may need more sophisticated health systems?
Yes, so they're certainly not going to be available for mass distribution. You can't do that in a primary healthcare setting with an untrained healthcare worker. It will require hospital settings, but there are hospitals in developing countries that are capable of providing those. And we're not talking about a huge number of doses. And as you heard, it's really for people who are particularly at risk, who have already contracted the virus. So yes, it's a challenge. It's certainly not going to be the long-term solution in developing countries. That long-term solution will require cheaper, easier to use and distribute treatments like the dexamethasone, which has come up a couple of times. That's a pretty cheap, easy to manufacture steroid. And we've been working with groups like the African Medical Supplies Platform, which is a new group, to try and get that distributed across Africa. And we'll be hoping to see the same with some of the cheaper, easier to manufacture vaccines as well.
When we have one more question on monoclonal antibodies, I'll pose to Janet, Dr. Woodcock, and then I'll move on. One of our audience members asks, how many infusions do the monoclonal antibodies require, and how long is immunity conferred? What have you seen on that?
Well, it depends on the type of monoclonal. They generally all only require single infusion. And I will say that I hope, based on the data we've seen, we could get down to an intramuscular or subcutaneous injection, which would really be a lot more helpful. As far as how long, quote, they last, most human IgG half-life might be a month or so. Some of the antibodies are modified in their Fc region, and they may have very prolonged half-lives and stick around a long time. And those may be very useful, for example, for prophylaxis, particularly of people who don't respond well to a vaccine or those who don't want to get vaccinated.
I wonder if we can bring up the answers of the poll question that everybody just took. It seemed pretty clear before we came away from it that a lot of folks are pretty worried about a renewed wave. Yeah, it looks like 76% are very concerned, 19% somewhat concerned, 5% not very concerned. I would love to talk with you guys and hear from that 5% who's not very concerned. But this brings us to another question from our audience. Somebody asks, what's the current thinking on immunity post-recovery of COVID-19? And are there any implications for herd immunity? Janet, I don't know if you might want to take that one.
Well, obviously, how long a vaccine or actual immunity post-infection will last is a burning question, right? We can deal with this if it isn't, prolonged, but it will make everything a lot more complicated. There have been cases, of course, of reinfection, but we don't know whether those are outliers or whether or not, in fact, immunity might wane over time. I'm fairly optimistic that vaccination or natural infection will actually confer pretty good long-term immunity, although perhaps you could acquire a less severe version of the infection.
Well, I want to bring up some other poll questions. And while everybody's taking the poll, I'm going to ask Dr. Woodcock one more question about clinical trials. So the poll questions I'd like to bring up are numbers 1 and 2, which ask the audience, do you plan to get a COVID-19 vaccine if one becomes available? And if not, or you're not sure, why not? So if our audience, when that poll question comes up, could start taking it, I'm going to ask Dr. Woodcock about our system in the United States for conducting clinical trials. I think you have some pretty strong opinions on the trials that have been conducted so far during this pandemic. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was still working at the FDA, we commissioned big surveys, which we have maintained, of all registered clinical trials worldwide. And what we found that over 90% of them would not yield actionable data, and that still is maintained. So that means that most of the trials that are ongoing, and the same is true in the United States, are not going to change the standard of care. And this is a huge problem, that the trials that are adequately powered and randomized and could change standard care are being slowed because there's competition at the sites of medical centers and so forth for patients. Meanwhile, the vast number of the patients in the community, a huge number of people, are not offered entry into clinical trials. And let's contrast this with the recovery trial in the UK, which is a much smaller country, but has managed to randomize really tens of thousands of people and will yield, I think, actionable data on every one of their arms that they are evaluating.
So it almost seems unbelievable. 90% of these clinical trials aren't going to give us useful information to actually change the way this disease is treated. Why is that the case?
The trials are small, they often aren't randomized, and they're enrolling slowly because of this competition. And so even if they had aspirations to have a large enough patient enrollment to be yielding actionable data, they actually are not enrolling enough people. And so we just don't have answers, even though some of these trials were started early in the pandemic. And this shows, I think, the weaknesses of our clinical trial system in the United States. This is common and has been the case all along, but now the pandemic has really highlighted this problem.
Well, Michelle, I'll ask you to kind of weigh in on that as well. What do you see from the member companies in bio about decisions on how to conduct these clinical trials and communications on how best to generate actionable data?
Well, the companies have been trying to work with scientists, work with regulators to design their trials as best as possible. But Janet is hitting on some key barriers, not just in the COVID space, but we see this in other disease areas as well. So we do need to try to marshal our resources. One of the things that we've been working on quite a bit at Bio is working on the diversity and the representation in the clinical trials, particularly in the vaccine space, but in all the COVID trials in particular, because we're seeing higher rates of mortality and morbidity in Latinx and Black Americans that we do not fully understand, that seems to go beyond just the increased risk of exposure. It's very, very critically important that we understand how these populations would respond to potential therapeutics, as well as whether or not potential vaccines would really protect them. And so we were very gratified to see one of our member companies, Moderna, for example, recently slowing their clinical trial so they could try to improve their minority enrollment rates, because this is a critical thing to happen so that we can have a vaccine that truly protects the population.
Well, let's start talking about the vaccine. I wonder if we can see the results of that poll that everybody just took. Do you plan to get a vaccine assuming one becomes available? 73% of you say yes, 3% say no, and 24% say you're not sure. And I don't know if we have the results of the second poll, which was if the answer is no or not sure, why? And I guess I'll see if those come up. But in the meantime, we have a question for Janet, which is, oh, here we go. There we go. If no or not sure, well, it's trying to slide over. There we go. Most people feel they are concerned the development has been too fast. 36% are not confident it'll be safe. And 16% say they don't trust the government or the drug companies. Okay, that makes me want to ask you guys about trust. So, Janet, how do you address that concern that this is moving too quickly?
Well, I think there's just a huge misunderstanding, and probably the name Operation Warp Speed isn't helping any in this. The speed at which something moves is due to a number of factors. Many of them have nothing to do with how much evaluation is done. These vaccines will have the standard evaluation, right? A 30,000 patient or more trial, right, in which there is follow-up for several months after vaccination, and then there's waiting till enough events occur, events meaning infection, to see if the vaccine is effective and to get really fairly precise estimates on how effective the vaccine is. That's not different than any other vaccine that is developed, right? What is different is at the same time this is going on, the manufacturing is being scaled up, even though we don't know whether the vaccine will work. And also massive plans are being put in place for distribution. Now, some people, in my experience, are just risk averse. Some people want the latest thing. And so I'm not surprised that the audience and the whole population, are thinking about whether or not they would take a vaccine that was just approved or approved under an EUA. And the reason is a lot of people, for any given step in life, right, some people want to hold back. And right now, there's some people are not leaving their houses at all because of COVID-19. Other people, as you know, are off, interacting with people. And so there's a range of behavior in the human population, and I'm not surprised this is one of these. However, the actual facts are the clinical evaluation of vaccines will be very thorough. The one thing we won't have is really long-term information. For example, how long does the effectiveness last? Okay, when do you have to get revaccinated? We will get that information, but it will take longer. And I think the real question, the real issue that people have is why did it only take a year? And so that makes us worried. And there are many people who want other people to get vaccinated first. That would be people like me, right? And see what happens. And then I think many people will get vaccinated once they have seen that a lot of their neighbors and other people have done this and everything's turned out okay. So I do think it's natural.
Well, I'm going to bring up the last poll question, and then I'm going to pose a question from the audience to Michelle. The third polling question here is, do you trust the information you receive about COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines from government agencies like the NIH, FDA, and CDC? Now, as we're talking about trust here, and this question obviously is about government agencies, but Michelle, I wonder if you can answer this question from the audience, which is how do we increase trust in a vaccine for minority populations who have not traditionally engaged in medical research? This is obviously such an important question. Are you seeing, you mentioned Moderna slowing its clinical trial enrollment in order to ensure more diversity in the clinical trials, but how has this been going so far, would you say, from what you've seen, and what are things that can be done to enhance trust?
This is the question that keeps me up at night. As I referred to earlier, we don't fully understand how COVID is behaving perhaps somewhat differently in minority populations. Is it the comorbidities? Is it underlying biology? We just do not know. And so if our communities do not participate in the trials for these solutions and these preventative measures, then our communities may not fully participate in the fruit that they bear, in the protection and in the cures and therapies. So it's critically important that our communities participate, but we're seeing everything. And, we've been having a series of these conversations over the course of the summer at Bio. We started our bioequality agenda, of which the first arm is reducing healthcare disparities and improving diversity in clinical trials. And we're really focused on the COVID trials. Particularly, we've been working with the National Medical Association, which is the Black NMA. We've been working with the National Association of Black Churches. We've been trying to match our COVID vaccine manufacturers to specific minority groups that might be able to help them enroll, since they're looking for healthy patients in that setting as opposed to patients who are ill. But it's really about us having a community conversation about how so many minority communities are really geared towards making sure that they bring others along in their community and wrap their arms around those that are less fortunate within their communities. And participating in this research is another form of that. It's another form of community engagement. It's another form of giving back. It's another form of standing up and helping either your African-American or Latinx community rise. And so this is so important that we participate at all levels of society and put the past behind us. There are safeguards now for the conduct of clinical trials that were not even thought of when Tuskegee happened. And so we're living in a modern age, and if we're going to participate in the modern solutions, we have to take part.
We've got a lot of great questions coming in, and I'll just tell the audience we have just more than 10 minutes left, so I'll try to get to all of them and put them in if you haven't yet and you have a question you want us to get to. We've got one for Mark. You mentioned this earlier, the COVAX facility that is designed essentially to ensure that countries, everybody who participates in this, can get access to a vaccine. Somebody asks, why hasn't the US joined the COVAX facility and China recently joined? Is that an issue?
So the U.S. has said at the moment that it won't join, partly because of the involvement of the World Health Organization. And as you know, the Trump administration has said that they are planning to pull out of the World Health Organization and its funding. COVAX is actually much larger than the WHO. The WHO is a critical partner, but it includes multiple governments, philanthropies like us, other partners like the Global Fund to fight HIV, TB, and malaria, the Gavi Vaccine Alliance I'd mentioned earlier, CEPI, the collaborative group to look at vaccine research. And so there are discussions underway, and in fact, in some of the draft bills that came from both the Republican side in the Senate and the Democratic side most recently in the House in Congress, have put in tentative commitments from the U.S. to support Gavi and potentially the Global Fund for vaccine and therapeutic distribution in the developing countries. And so that is a way that the U.S. could help support COVAX without providing direct support to the World Health Organization. So we very much hope that that might happen, although obviously there's some wider complications around the stimulus bill. But more broadly, it has been encouraging to see, and as you say, yes, China just recently came in. The deadline for announcing initial participation was last Friday. I haven't seen the final list of how many countries, but our sense is well over 150 countries, which is a good part of the planet, has agreed, and nearly every sort of wealthy country, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, etc., have all participated. So this is something that can grow. It's not a done deal. We're have the first wave of investments and deals in it. It's a risk sharing thing. Part of the value add, even for the U.S. and Operation Warp Speed, which have done sort of multiple products, is there are many more products available. We don't know which ones are going to be most successful, and so part of this is both. And we certainly don't think individual countries shouldn't make their own bilateral deals. That makes a lot of sense. They're looking after their own citizens. That's very appropriate. But our hope is this can be a both and, because by pooling financing and pooling risk, we're able to have many, many more shots on goal as a global community. and then the outcomes of those shots and goals will be distributed more equitably. And as I described earlier, that will actually save more lives and be better for the planet and allow the economy to get back to normal more quickly. So it's really a win-win.
Well, Janet, there's a question here for you from the audience, which I think everybody wants to know. When can the vast number of the population expect to go to their physician or their pharmacy, like a CVS or Walgreens, to get a COVID-19 vaccine?
Well, I think the estimates people have given for early availability are fair, which would be November, December, but that isn't going to be for everybody. Let's be clear about that. If all goes well, I would say in March or so, the availability is going to be much broader, and every month after that broader. But in the very early stages, we're going to have to try to hit the most vulnerable and make sure that they are protected first. So, and it really depends on the success of how many programs are successful. The more programs are successful, then the more product we will have available. And we can just hope that a lot of them are, that their manufacturing goes well, that those doses keep rolling out as projected. As I said, there are extensive plans for distribution, massive plans for distribution. So I don't think there should be bottlenecks there. So it's really first the clinical data, then how much is actually available. And actually, as we were just discussing, if too many people refuse this, there'll be more to go around for the other people who are willing to be the first set of people vaccinated. So, but by March, April, we should really see broad availability, if all goes well.
And Janet, as a follow-up, is it still the plan that children will be tested a little bit later? We're doing adult studies right now, and so we may see the pediatric doses lag by several months, just so folks are clear on the expectations.
Right, that's my understanding. Mm-hmm. But frankly, for vaccine, what we need to do is get enough people vaccinated, of any kind of people, so that the transmission rate starts dropping. And then, everybody is going to be safer.
And just to follow up on that idea, I mean, we typically hear about herd immunity needing to be about 70% of the population. I mean, what is the actual target for getting folks vaccinated in order to achieve some kind of herd immunity or slowing of transmission, at least?
Well, I think we'd like to vaccinate every possible person who's willing to be vaccinated, right, as soon as possible, because you can decrease. It isn't like a magic number, all right? The more people who are protected from the virus, the less spread. That number is going to drop as far as how many people are infected, what the transmission rate is, right? And so it's kind of a continuum. And the more we can do, the better off we're going to be. It'll probably be a long time till we're like polio or something, where we can talk about really having every single person protected and eradicate the spread. But we can control this pandemic with reasonable vaccination programs, including we have to do this in all countries. Couldn't agree more.
I wonder if we could see the results of that last poll question everybody just took. This was the question about trust in the information coming from government agencies, NIH, CDC, FDA. Okay, 61% say they do trust the information they're getting from government agencies, 30% say not sure, and 9% say no. I would say the audience who is watching this is probably an audience who is more engaged and probably trusts those agencies a little more potentially than the general population. But my last question for you about trust actually is to Michelle. The industry has been stepping out, as we talked about, making pledges about safety, but the industry is also kind of at a low point in terms of respect from society. CNBC has been doing polls with Change Research about just how different players are perceived by the public, and the pharmaceutical industry is only getting like a 9% approval rating, even though it is doing unprecedented work in this pandemic. I mean, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on, can the industry win back the trust of society, and what is really on the line here for you guys as an industry?
Well, it is our mission at Bio to try to win back that trust, and it doesn't happen overnight. It really happens through demonstration of your actions. So we have to be out there showing that we're willing to roll up our sleeves and do everything we can to try to stop this pandemic, and then not stop there, to show that we are as equally committed to making sure that those in need receive what is produced. And I think that is going to be the crucible by which our industry is judged for some time to come, and perhaps rightly so. But, you know, it's amazing to me, because I've had the good fortune over the last 25 years to meet so many dedicated scientists, you know, whether it was in the FDA or working within Johnson & Johnson. I've seen scientists throughout our industry who chose this field because they're committed to human health. They want to make a difference, and they're putting their brain power towards trying to produce pragmatic solutions that help patients. And so I just hope that the general population gets to see, you know, what it's like to have to wait on biomedical research, how committed those researchers are to making a difference, and then how amazing it is when they come up with a breakthrough that really changes the world. And I think that's what we're going to see in this case.
Mark, a final question for you from the audience is, the response to COVID-19 has required significant philanthropic investment. Is that a sustainable model for the future, and what should we do differently in the future?
Yeah, absolutely not. That philanthropy could come in the short term. We can take big risks early, which we were able to do in this crisis. We can make some investments more quickly than government or often the private sector. We can support regulators, but this needs to be something that's done and uses the full resources of the public and the private sector. The public sector, both in sort of a regulatory approval, but also bigger research funding and needs, and the private sector, because that's where the deep ingenuity and the R&D expertise is. And so our hope certainly is that once we're through the immediate crisis, is both countries will take a look internally, but also look collectively, globally, what kind of structure do we need put in place? We need much more ambitious research agendas. We need different trial infrastructures Dan had talked about to make sure we don't have these same kind of challenges again. We need different surveillance and support so we can track these diseases. So there's a huge opportunity out there. And again, philanthropy can play a key role seeding that, but this needs to put in place the full resources of government and the private sector.
Well, Dr. Woodcock, I'm going to give the last word to you, since we didn't get to hear from you for most of the beginning, and pose to you that question: when do we get back to normal? And then also ask you if you have any last thoughts that you didn't get to share at the beginning that you'd like to share with the audience.
Well, I think we'll get back to normal sometime in this late spring. That's my hope. If all goes well, we should be on a trajectory to overcome this virus. As far as lessons learned, I really share what's been said by everyone else, which is we can do better than this. This response, we've done the best we can with the infrastructure we have, but we really could have done better. And I think the recovery trial in the UK is a wonderful example of how, if you have a collective effort, you can really evaluate things rapidly and enroll out in the community, enroll everybody in your trials and have everybody be able to contribute. So I really hope that we take these lessons learned as we recover and apply them so that if we have new challenges, we can meet them rapidly.
All right. Well, our time is up. This was a great conversation. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Mark, all for being here. And thanks for you guys in the audience for participating. You made it great. Thanks, everybody.